Welcome to lesson 5, and today we're going to be looking at how do we manage cloud governance. So how do we manage cloud governance? So as you know from our previous session, we have talked about the 5 characteristics of cloud. We've also talked about the difference of the 3 cloud service models. We've also talked about the cloud deployment models. What's really going to be interesting about today's session is that we're going to focus on 4 main objectives. The first objective relates to cloud concepts and how do these concepts relate to governance. We're also going to talk about risk management and the concepts that it holds, especially within the context of cloud. And we're also going to talk about how do we understand compliance and the cloud. And finally, we're going to manage policies and procedures for cloud services. We're going to talk about how do you actually manage those policies and procedures. So focusing on topic A, we're going to be looking at how do you relate cloud concepts to governance. So we're going to start from the basic, which is governance and the 5 cloud characteristics, which you should all remember is from the NIST. And the 5 characteristics are, the first one is, if we're going to recap, on-demand self-service. So this is, the definition of this is when cloud users can provision resources whenever they need them without actually having a manual intervention from providers. Now, when we look at the governance aspect of this, it's being able to modify policies that allows users to leverage these services while assuring appropriate controls. We're also going to be looking, especially when you look at governance in relation to on-demand self-service, it's how do you ensure proper change management protocols for self-service provisioning? And this is needed to avoid unforeseen impacts that may be had. The second characteristic is network access. Now, this is when cloud services can be accessed from various devices all over the internet. So no matter where you're in the world, you can access the internet. So someone in the UK and someone in Nigeria both can have access to the internet. And when we're looking at the governance aspect is how do you account for the various devices when designing security protocols? And how do you keep abreast the internet vulnerabilities and ensures that resources are shielded from threats? So when you're looking at governance at broad access network, you're looking at, the risk management that includes the internet vulnerabilities. And you're also thinking about how you're accounting for the various devices when designing your security protocol within the cloud. Now, the third concept is resource pooling. So resource pooling is when cloud providers use a multi-tenant model where resources are pooled to serve different consumers. So you're wondering, how is Amazon, Google, and Microsoft, how are they all able to have what can seem as countless and countless, areas of the cloud? And that is because of resource pooling. And when we look at the governance aspects of this is when businesses in regulated sectors ensure compliance by considering public clouds for sensitive data and storage. I remember what I said, when we're considering the factors that we consider when looking at which of the cloud characteristics we're going to consider for governance. And I think it's very interesting to kind of utilize, okay, what type of cloud service model is most appropriate for my organization, for my company? This leads me to the fourth characteristic, which is rapid elasticity. Now, this is, when capabilities can be easily scaled out or scaled in. Remember from our first session, we looked at scaled out and scaled in. And what's quite interesting when we look at the governance aspect is how do you update your change management protocols to ensure that they can handle rapid scaling? Now, we're going to be talking about SOPs later on during this session, but it's how do you keep your SOPs current to avoid misconfiguration, but also to help you avoid unnecessary costs as well. And the final one is measured service. So this is when cloud computing resources are metered. And because they're metered, it means that users are only billed based on their consumption. Now, when we're thinking of the governance aspect and how it links to these characteristics, is that with measured services, you have to implement a resource monitoring to avoid unforeseen costs. You also want to be able to align your change management to account for cost implications as well as modifications. Now, we're now going to go into the 3 cloud service models. Now, if you remember, there are 3 types. There are SaaS, PaaS, and IaaS. When we're thinking of SaaS, which is software as a service, this is when providers can offer software applications over the internet. And when we're thinking about the governance aspect of SaaS, you're thinking about how to ensure and that the resource management aligns with the SaaS solution that we are selecting. The second thing that you need to think about is how do you establish your access control to maintain data security and also, very, very important, maintain your integrity. Now, when we're talking about platform as a service, which is PaaS, the definition for that is, this is when cloud providers offer a platform for services to develop, run, and manage the application. I think a great example I gave was Google App Store is a great example when we're thinking about platform as a service. Now, when we're looking at the governance aspect of PaaS, that is when cloud providers offer a platform for customers to develop, run, and manage their application. So this is, I think it's important when you're thinking about it in regards to PaaS. For example, how do you ensure your applications are developed in a secure manner? Another thing we have to think about the governance aspects of PaaS is how do you ensure that applications meet all necessary compliance standards? So remember, for PaaS, you have to think about how do you ensure that your applications are developed in a secure manner? And the second point to consider is how do you ensure that all these applications meet the necessary compliance standards that are required for your industry? Now, the last one we're going to talk about is infrastructure as a service, also known as IaaS. Now, this is a great way to kind of think about what an infrastructure as a service is that it's a virtualized computing resource over the internet. So when we're thinking about a governance aspect, you're thinking about how do you develop the SOP? How do you cover the provisioning, the monitoring, and the management of the infrastructure resources? These are things that you're going to have to think about, which is obviously a larger scale than the other 2. But it's definitely something that I recommend you guys maybe researching more in your own time to learn more about infrastructure as a service. Now we're going to go into the third one. I think you guys have already seen these models plenty of times. We're not going to go into cloud deployment models, which I think everyone should know by now. Now, if we're looking at the difference between these 4, private cloud is operated by one organization and it can be managed by the organization or a third party helping the organization, right? This is when it's a private cloud. Now, if it's a public cloud, this is when the cloud infrastructure is open for public use, right? It is often owned by cloud service providers. But when we're thinking about the governance of this, because it's quite huge, is that number 1, how do you implement for your private? You're thinking about how do you provide more control of your data, right? So I would say with a private cloud, it's most suitable for organizations with a stringent data regulation. Now, when we're talking about public cloud, which I alluded to earlier, when we're looking at the governance, it's how do you implement rigorous risk management policies and how are you able to prioritize resource and data access control? Now, when we're looking at community cloud, this is a little bit different. Why? Because the cloud infrastructure is shared by several organizations with shared concerns. Now, an obvious, governance aspect of this is how would you ensure collaborative governance that aligns with shared security and management needs, right? It's no hard feelings. And I think the final one is hybrid cloud, which is a combination of either the private, the public, or community. And the governance aspect you need to think about that is how do you design governance frameworks that cover the complexities and variances of the different cloud models that have been put in place. Now, I will say before we go into the second part that cloud governance is extremely important. Why? Because it ensures that the cloud service are used in a way that aligns with an organization's business objective as well as risk appetite. So proper governance, it's needed because it helps businesses to be able to achieve their business goals, but also maintain security and compliance, which is, from my experience and my career, is a very, very tricky thing to do, but it can be done. Now, when we move to the next, we're looking at how do we apply risk management concepts. So a good way to think about this is to start from the beginning, which is what is risk. So risk assessment, especially, is a comprehensive study aimed at identifying, but also how do you address the potential risk affecting your organization, its operations, clients, and systems, right? And it's important because it helps in proactive planning. It also helps in decision making, and it helps you, both as an individual and as an organization, especially to be able to enhance the security and resilience of the organization, especially when it comes to processes, systems. How do you ensure that your regulatory compliance and data actually adheres to it? And that's essentially what it is when we're looking at risk management. So the next part is, what are the steps, right? This is a great example here of the diagram, which starts with identifying hazards, then identifying, okay, once I've identified the hazard, now who's going to be likely affected by the hazard? And how do I evaluate risk and the mitigations, as well as document findings, and most importantly, the reviews that are done on an annual basis? All of this play in a part in actually ensuring that risk assessment is needed and embedded in the culture. So now we're going to look at classifications of risk. So risk tend to be kind of categorized in 4 ways, which is likelihood. So that's the probability of a risk occurring. And, an example of this would be the higher likelihood of security breaches of an unprotected system, right? That's an example. Another one is impact. You have to think about the impact. And the impact is all about the potential consequences or damage caused by a risk. So this can deal with either a loss of data, financial loss, or even damage to the reputation, right? And then finally, it's actions that need to be taken when we're looking at response, action that needs to be taken to address the identified risk. So this could be, for example, implementing an encryption for data security. So now we're going to look at asset inventory. So I would say that this is not necessary for cloud resources, but it is important to know. So asset inventory is when it's important, but I will kind of describe it a little bit. So asset inventory is basically documents that are resource deployed so they can be managed and mitigated. So you can't protect what you don't know, which is why a lot of security third parties will spend a lot of time looking at the specific threat to the organization and what the impact of that would be. So now when we move on to the next page, we're looking at data ownership. So data ownership, you have to think about 3 things, which is the risk and consideration, as well as examples that might be helpful. So a risk in this case would be losing ownership or control over data stored or shared on a cloud platform. Now, an example of this would be social media platform, often claiming ownership of content shared by users, right? Financially. And then finally is consideration um, from the conversations we had around data ownership is that you have to be aware that data ownership policies of cloud and social media platforms as well. And how does that affect the customer strategy, organizational strategy as well? Now we're going to go into risk response. So risk response deals with how do we implement and measure the reduced likelihood of the impact of risk. So for example, in the middle is risk, and then you have the four considerations, which are mitigation, acceptance, transfer, and avoidance. And we're now going to go a little bit deeper into it. So now if we're talking about mitigation, so you have to consider within the step, have you taken the necessary precautions to prevent a particular risk that you are scared about? The second thing is risk can only be managed and minimized, but it can't be eliminated, which is why there are so many ways of mitigating and so many softwares out there, such as VPN, the use of encryption, geo-redundancy. These are other ways in which you're going to be able to contact your person that you're caring for, your family member. Now we're looking at avoidance. So avoidance is all about keeping the business out of a position that can be affected by the risk. So an example of that is retaining a highly sensitive data on premise rather than in the cloud for greater security. So you have to be able to weigh the pros and cons of everything that you're buying at the moment. Now, when we are looking at acceptance, that is when you don't take an action to mitigate the risk. Why? Because the impact tends to be quite low. An example is natural earthquake or natural disaster, right? These are things you have to think about, but especially if you're working in business continuity and that space where you are trying to get your organization to be operation resilient, but also looking to see ways in which kind of the risk can be developed into something more, or if it can be resolved quickly. Now we're going to deal with transfer. Now, transfer is very, very interesting, and it's interesting for different reason. With transfer, you're looking at how do you shift the burden of a risk to a third party. So an example is, getting insurance to cover the data breaches expenses in the future, which is why it's extremely important to get your chartered status, but also to be able to get your I think with transport to be able to get your organization prepared for potential data breaches as well. So when we're dealing with specifically transfer, is you are shifting the risk to the third party. Going back when we're thinking about acceptance is how are you choosing to acknowledge the existence of a risk by not taking action? And that is due to either it having a low impact or a low probability. And then avoidance. How do you stay away from activities or actions that might expose the organization to certain risk? And then finally, going back again, mitigation. How do you implement measures to reduce the likelihood or impact of the risks? So now we're going to look at risk documentation. So when we're looking at risk documentation, before I move forward, we look at three things. We look at risk register, we look at vendor lock-in, and then we also are going to be looking at data probability. So going to risk register. What is a risk register? It's a systematic tool used to document and manage risk. So it is a evolving document that is constantly updated, especially when new risks are identified, as well as existing ones that are currently being resolved. And as you can see, the common sections that exist within a risk register is risk. That's when you're writing the potential event or situation that may cause harm to your organization. Then description, which is a detailed explanation or context about the risk. Then you have the likelihood, which is the probability of the risk reoccurring. And then you have to think about the impact. And the impact really is quite an interesting one because it's you can get it confused with likelihood, but it's not. Impact deals with the potential damage or consequence if a risk materializes. And then you have severity, which is the overall seriousness of the risk. And sometimes it has a combination of likelihood and impact. And then you have your mitigation, right? Going back to what we discussed earlier is what are the steps or measures that are being taken to reduce the risk within the organization? So an example of that could be implementing encryption and multi-factor authentication, which means that the current risk, when addressed or whether in progress, it can be seen, but also you know that that is something that is a risk that's being treated through your implementation tactics. So we're now going to go into vendor lock-in. So what is vendor lock-in? So vendor lock-in is a situation when an organization becomes overly reliant on a specific vendor for its product services. And there's a danger to it. There's a danger because it can lead to difficulty in the organization being able to switch from one provider to another. Why? Because of the cost that's involved, and also the inconvenience that is caused. Then you have the next one, which if we go back to vendor lock-in, which deals with, the implications I'll say it has on the cloud is it's dependent on a cloud service provider's unique and proprietary services, right? And it also deals with the loss of flexibility and control due to the challenges in moving services from one cloud to another. Then you have your mitigation strategies, right? And there are three types that you can consider. The first one is how do you diversify services across multiple vendors? Also, how do you prioritize open standards and interoperable solutions? And lastly is how do you build your exit strategy into your cloud adoption plan? These are mitigation strategies that can be put in place to be able to reduce that risk of having that vendor lock-in or being overly reliant on a particular vendor. Now going into data probability, this deals with, I would define this as the ease in which data can be moved, shared, or reused across different cloud service platforms. Now, there's a challenge to this, as with the other ones. And the challenge is that difficulties can arise if a data is stored in a proprietary format or with a specific dependencies. This is because you're migrating data. Migrating data can be time consuming as well as costly. You also have to think about the contractual considerations. And that's because organizations need to ensure that data probability is explicitly addressed in contracts with cloud service providers. So if you go back to previous conversations that we've had, especially when it dealt with the contract and doing business with cloud service providers, what to include within contracts and things like that. Data probability is also one that is important because, it's going to affect the ease in which data can be actually moved, shared, and reused across different cloud platforms. Now, I would say that another contractual consideration that organizations will need to think about is details like data formats, tools, and processes for migration, and any associated costs should be also made clear so that the organization does not get into a vendor lock-in situation. So looking at a recap of everything that we've studied. So we've looked at risk assessment, which defines the risk that an organization has evaluated or documented. Risk assessments also deal with the following steps, such as determining what the hazards are, what the potential harm is, identifying what and who can be harmed, being able to evaluate your risk and develop mitigation strategies, also being able to document the risk findings and mitigation, and finally, being able to review the risk assessment regularly. So data classification helps employees understand the proper use as well as the security of data. And this is mostly done using a software or an operating system that can help the organization manage, know what they can manage and know what they can't manage, especially within the cloud. Another thing to think about is risk responses, which are four, and that is your mitigation, avoidance, acceptance, and transfer. Another good way to have an acronym, so you can have an acronym of MAT or TAM, which kind of goes with the same thing that allows you to be able to answer that question. Now, one thing to know is that, especially with a vendor lock-in, is that it can be a risk. Especially when you're thinking about changing cloud providers, and it's a little bit difficult because you didn't read the contract well with your cloud service provider. Now we're going to go into topic C, and this is all about understanding compliance and the cloud. So you want to be able to identify the importance and impact of compliance in the cloud. So when we're looking at compliance and standards, we're going to talk about four different things. We're going to talk about your data sovereignty. We're going to talk about your regulatory concerns, as well as your industry-based requirements. We're also going to look at international standards as well as certifications. So when we're dealing with, if I could go back actually, when you're dealing with compliance and standards, it is crucial that organizations are able to understand the compliance and standards landscape, especially when navigating the complex world, which is, cloud service. And by doing this, it allows organizations to be able to adhere to legal operations and to be able to build their trust with their customers, as well as protect the organization's data. Now, when we move on to data sovereignty is basically is a principle. Is a principle that digital data is subject to legal framework of the country where it's stored. And the implications that this has for the cloud is that data can be stored in multiple jurisdictions due to cloud redundant nature, as well as exposing organizations to various regulatory environments, except for their existing environment. Now, how can cloud service providers exist? Now, cloud service provider, in the topic of data sovereignty, they offer data residency options. They can assist with that in regards to ensuring that the data stays within a certain boundaries. Your CSPs can also provide transparency regarding data center locations as well as storage locations. And then finally is offering tools and configuration to cater to a specific or regional needs, which can be a lot, as you can imagine. So when we go into regulatory concerns and industry-based requirements, I will say that even in this case, even if data is stored off-premise in a cloud, the organization remains responsible for compliance and industry regulations. So it's also good to know that despite all of this, when we're looking at it specifically, is that even that the data is stored off the premise in the cloud, but that doesn't change the fact that the responsibility remains on the organization's kind of doorstep rather than the cloud service provider. Now, when we're looking at regulatory concerns, especially regulatory examples, we have your PCI, which deals with, payment card industry. And essentially, it ensures that companies can securely handle card transactions as well as protect against data theft. And you have your Sarbanes-Oxley, which is a regulation aimed at improving the accuracy and reliability of corporate financial disclosures. And then finally, you have your HIPAA, which is health insurance portability and accountability. And this allows you to protect patient health as well as information. Now, the final step I would say with regulatory concerns and industry-backed organizations is auditing and documentation. This is important because regular audits can ensure that data is stored in the cloud and can actually see, okay, regular audits has allowed us to know, okay, how are we actually going to store our data on the cloud securely? And by doing those audits, you'll be able as an organization to know where your weak points or your blind spots are for you to be able to improve. We're now going to move on to international standards by the ISO. And it's basically, it was established by the International Organization for Standards, and it provides a framework to ensure consistency across the industry as well as countries. So when we're looking at the key cloud standards is, number one, how do you define cloud-specific terminologies? And secondly, how do you clarify various cloud models? So the benefits, I would say, is that it allows you to create a common language. It also allows you to ensure among CSPs, government and regulatory bodies, that your organization is doing its part. We're now going to go to certifications. So certifications is recognitions given to cloud service providers after an independent audit. And this allows the organization to kind of confirm that they meet the industry and governmental standards. So why is this important? Because it provides assurance to customers about security and compliance posture of cloud service providers. Now, the process is that it normally involves a thorough evaluation by third-party organizations, and then assessing what your CSP infrastructure policies and procedures will look like. Now, when we're looking at the next one, which, now we're going into topic D. When we're looking at, topic D, we're looking at policies and procedures, which is fitting. So if you heard me earlier, I talked about SOPs. SOPs are basically standard operating procedures. Now, what is important with what we're discussing today is that recognition gives cloud service providers after an independent audit to confirm that they meet certain requirements from the industry and governmental standards. The second part is the importance of it. The importance of the audit is that it provides assurance to customers about the security and compliant postures of the CSP, which is your cloud service provider. And when we're looking at the process, it normally involves the evaluation of a third-party organization, and then also allows the participant I'll say the cybersecurity professional to be able to ensure that standardization, raising errors, and maintaining quality in operations is key. And a good way to think about it as well is that you will normally have to use a template, and the templates will include your name, your department, your data, the purposes, and also actual procedures as well as evidence. So now we are going into change management. What is change management? So change management is the structured approach to transitioning individuals, teams, and organizations from the current state to a desired future state. Now, it normally works in stages. When we're looking at each stage, we're looking at first, how do you prepare for change? How do you, understanding change, its implications and strategies, and how to implement it? How do you prepare for that change? The second one is supporting during the change. So providing training, resources, and communication. And also the third one is, how do you then create help after the change? So again, this is ensuring post-change support, feedback mechanisms, and continuous improvement. And finally, what is the implication does this have on the cloud? What I would say is that, transitioning to cloud-based system can present a profound change for employees and overall business operations, right? Because it requires careful planning, training, and a post-deployment support as well. So now we're going to go into resource management. So resource management is basically what it says on the tin, in the sense that is efficient and effective deployment and allocation of an organization's resource when and where they're needed. So having tangible resources, which can include physical assets like money, supplies, houses. You then want to have intangible resources, which are your non-physical assets like time, skill, and human resources. And then you want to think about the impact this has on the cloud. So for example, cloud services can fundamentally alter how resources are managed. For example, financial management may shift from capital expenditures, money spent on physical infrastructure, to operational expenditures, which is which is basically, I would say, going back to it, is okay. I would say going back into resource management utilization, especially when we're looking at the impact on how it has on cloud, is a good example would be financial management may shift from capital expenditure to money spent on physical, which is operational expenditure and services and things like that. Now, how do you ensure that, the cloud services can fundamentally, utilize the resources that you have? So that's all about resource management, is looking at the utilization of tangible resources, of intangible resources, and also many changes that may result into resource management. So for example, if you're migrating, you're going to be thinking of resource management. If we're looking at the characteristics and looking at that last part, which is you only get billed for what you consume, again, it goes back to the resource management. When you're thinking as an organization, how do we save money? How do we ensure that, okay, we know we have a spike, so we spend a bit of money now, but we'll reduce money based on our overall long-term business strategy. So these are things to think about. And then obviously here, you have a good illustration. So you have your traditional systems, which are your administrator's task. So you have your administrator, and then you have your on-premise resources. Now, the on-premise resources has physical deployments, physical operations, hardware acquisition, hardware management, and patch management, right? But with a cloud, it removes the middleman, in the sense that the administrator can have virtual deployments, can do business operations, and can also then do business integrations, which is not highlighted as much as it should be. Now, when we're going into the final parts, which is policies, we're looking at 6 things, which is your CIA triad, your security policies, your incident response policies, access and control policies, as well as communication policies and department-specific policies. So I would say, like, policies in my mind, because I've been saying a lot of policies. Policies are foundational elements in any organization. And this is because it ensures your systematic governance and adheres to norms, standards, and legal requirements. So in this, with policies, you have different parts, like your incident response, your communication, and your department-specific regulation. So if we kind of recap into what we discussed last week, which is the CIA triad, remember that the CIA triad is a model designed to guide policies for information security within an organization. But also, it shows you that there are 3 elements that you have to think about when you're thinking about characteristics. And that is your confidentiality, how safe are they, its integrity, and also availability, because you want to be able to protect your data as well. Now, when we're looking at security policies, right, it's great because it allows the individual to articulate an organization's security posture and to be able to set deadlines for action. So when we're looking at the components, there are three parts, which is your internal factors, which is covering aspects like an employee behavior and account management, um, or external factors such as addressing issues such as hackers, threats, physical security, and power outages. Then we're looking at the other part, which is the key elements, and that deals with, the security objective, the policy scope, the policy goals, and other areas of responsibilities to think about. Also, another thing to think about is that employee engagement. Employees need to be able to read and write to abide under the security policy, and also to ensure the environment and the organization are fulfilling its word. Now, with security policy, I would say that there's definitely three things to have on your list if you're coming back home, and that's again internal and external. I would say that employees are often required to sign in the security policy. Once they agree to, for it to be read, it means that they can agree by it, but also be able to challenge the artist a little bit. Now, I would say that there are many templates that exist, and they usually contain security objectives, scope of policy, goals of policy, areas of responsibility, and also industry allegations. Now, when we go into incident response policies, this is actually quite interesting. Interesting in the sense that a good way to remember is through user account management, password management protocols. But since she already has those information, I would say that definitely write down the risk and create a incident response time based on tactics that were used on me. So when moving on to security, no, we're not moving to access control and control policies. So in this example, you want to be able to manage the interaction of users and data. So you want to be able to look at the creation, modification, deletion of user accounts, as well as user management I no longer use. And network access by personal service devices, remote access and VPN. It can work with the artist, but again, procedures need to be taken place to ensure that we're all abiding by the law. And when we're looking at communication policies, remember, you have kind of different aspects like email, instant messaging, texting, phone calls, blogs, social media. I would say that with the communications, especially when you converge in it, is that emails, instant messaging, text, phone calls, blogs, social media, both all are acceptable ways of communication. Key points to take on with the talent shop is that organizational ownership is communication of data. Being able to represent protocols and prevent unauthorized spokesperson activities or data risk associated with the communication. I don't expect anything but our child. When we go into the elements of communication, so when we're looking at representation protocols to prevent unauthorized spokesperson activities or data risk associated with the communication as well. So with communication policies, again, being able to understand what the data risk associated with each communication is, and then be able to mitigate those risks based on what we've already discussed with risk management much earlier on. So when we're looking at department-specific policies, that's tailored policies catering to the specific needs of the regulatory requirements of different departments. So an example could be the financial department may have policies that are distinct from those of marketing departments, for example, which is maybe more aligned with the financial regulations than the marketing team. And they'll be able to advise the marketing team on how to best market the product while being adhering to the regulations and standards set by the industry. Now, I would say with this particular policy, the objective is that it wants to ensure that every department adheres to both organizational as well as legal standards. Now, a good recap. But before I go into recap, I want to say one thing about policies, and that is policies play a critical role in articulating an organizational stance on various aspects. So this is ensuring alignment, security, and legal compliance. And being informed and adhering to policies is a collective responsibility, and it helps to foster a secure, efficient, and regulatory compliant environment. So that's why I'll say that, in my opinion, policies are extremely important, and they also play a huge part within cloud security. Now, to recap on everything discussed, cloud assessment and migration phases are excellent time to review, modify, and change policy documents. Now, when we're looking at standard operating procedures, they tend to be a standard task checklist. So steps will be done efficiently and more consistently. Then we have change management. Change management helps organizations more smoothly to implement changes to systems. So it could be them changing their IT system, migration from on-premise to cloud, and etc. Now, a cloud deployment is usually a significant change that requires careful change management. When we're looking at cloud services, these involve a different type of resource management, so that resource managed documents will then also be able to be updated as well. Now, finally, when we're looking at our recap, is that security policies define an organization's security stance and priorities, right? Because based on how the policies are done and how it's marketed, then employees will be able to kind of gauge whether they want to take part or not. Now, incident response policies provide specific steps towards mitigating a security accident. So this could be access and control policies that govern user management, permissions, network access, and other controls. And communication policies are important because they help to define how media can be used. So this could be email media, instant messaging, social media, and other tools. And finally, individual departments in your organizations may have a unique requirement that may be documented with department-specific bodies. So this is all a recap of everything that we've discussed today. Going back to the objectives, we've been able to look at how do we relate cloud concepts to governance. We've also been able to look at how do we apply risk management concepts, as well as understanding compliance and the cloud. And finally, we've been able to see how do we manage policies and procedures for the cloud service, which is a mouthful, but I think it does allow us to see how we've been able to go step by step on each stages.